All right, so we are now going to look at the career of Napoleon Bonaparte and his impact on France after the French Revolution. Now, you have to kind of understand that after the Reign of Terror ends and the government, a new government is formed known as the Directory, okay? And it's a group of 5 men who are all going to be in charge of the executive power in France. So remember, we had absolute monarchy, then we had the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and then that doesn't work out, and then we create a constitutional government, we execute the monarch. Now we have a full-on democratic process, but it's being held up by this reign of terror where people are really just trying to take power, taking away rights, censoring people. And so after the reign of terror ends, after they execute or after they kill Robespierre, this government is the Directory, okay? And they're going to split up the executive power in France. And the idea was that these 5 men are going to kind of turn the clock back to the liberal phase of the French Revolution because that phase had been much more stable than the radical phase, which ended up with the Reign of Terror. But the Directory government faces a lot of problems. For one thing, France is going to be dealing with a lot of food shortages. And you end up with chaos and instability and having to fight with foreign armies that are trying to invade France. And this means that there's going to be a lot of people that are not going to be able to stay at home and work on family farms, right? If you keep having to send people to war to keep all these foreign countries from coming in and taking your land or trying to reinstall the absolute monarchy, people aren't growing food, and that's going to lead to shortages. And so this is a major problem. Also, inflation is going to be a super big problem, and it's because paper money that is going to be printed during the time of the French Revolution is basically going to become worthless because they printed so much of it. There was so much in circulation that basically it meant nothing. And so prices are going to go sky high. And so you have all these economic problems. Of course, the old problem of national debt, you know, the one main problem that actually led to the French Revolution from the very beginning is also around and causing them problems. So the Directory comes up with a very inventive solution with kind of dealing with the national debt. And they decide they're not going to pay like half of the national debt, right? They just say, hey, I know we owe all this money, but we're just going to write off half of it. We're just not going to pay that back. Now, this is a great idea for the Directory because, you know, hey, now we owe half as much money, but not really, right? But it causes more problems because some of the members of the bourgeoisie were the ones who had basically invested in the government to begin with. So when the government says, we're just not going to pay this debt, they're basically telling the people who led the revolution, who had given everything that they had, sold land to donate money to the government. And now the government's going, hey, we appreciate all that, but, price of doing business, we're just not going to pay you back. And that's not going to make them very happy. And so when you have the threat of the Jacobin revolt, this all kind of comes to a head. But it was, in the first place, the Jacobins who had been pushing France in a new radical direction. And they had lost power because of the Thermidorian reaction, which we talked about in the last lecture. And there were some Jacobins who were supporting Robespierre that are still kind of hanging around in the background back here. So there's this fear that there's going to be a resurgence of these radical Jacobin people, that although the reign of terror is over, these Jacobins who were part of the bourgeoisie, who had been supportive of the reign of terror, maybe not carried it out themselves, but now they're really upset and that they're going to maybe try and push back in France into a second reign of terror. And so these are major problems that this Directory government is going to have to deal with. And because there's 5 people working all as the executive, they didn't always get along, and it created even more problems that pretty much you have a government that was at times pretty much paralyzed by disagreement and not knowing which direction to go in. And you put all of this together, and it's really going to give an opening for the rise of someone like Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Corsica. And you can see Corsica is this little island that's here, circled in red. It's not part of France, or at least the mainland of France itself. And in fact, people who lived on the mainland of France really looked down upon the Corsicans as being sort of like country hicks, okay? And so Napoleon is able to overcome this stigma concerning his heritage by having a really good career in the military. So when he joins the military, he very quickly distinguishes himself in battle, and he wins the support of the men around him, and that he leads into battle. And in fact, they give him the name Little Corporal. Now, chances are, if you've heard anything about Napoleon, my guess is you've probably heard that he was, short, right? When we think of, Napoleon, he was a little tiny fellow, right? In fact, there's a psychological complex that is a real, psychological kind of idea that it's called the Napoleon complex, which is like that short men feel resentment that they don't have height, so they're aggressive against taller people trying to get power for themselves and empower themselves, right? This idea of a Napoleon complex. The issue of Napoleon's, height has really been debated amongst historians. Most historians today think that really Napoleon was closer to the average height for men of his era, which means he was probably around 5'5", 5'6". Now you go, well, that's still not very tall, but you have to understand we have gotten, as a human race, significantly taller in the last 200 years, significantly taller. And that has a lot to do with, in my mind, probably survival of the fittest, kind of our evolution of sorts, that we don't have to spend all of our time, the vast majority of us, growing food by hand. So if you spend all day plowing and bent over, your body naturally is going to grow shorter so that it's not as much of a strain on your back to be bent over all the time. And now that we don't have to do that anymore, the fact that we are upright more as a species of, as humans, probably has contributed to the fact that we've just naturally gotten taller because evolutionary-wise, we don't need to be closer to the ground to hunt and forage for berries and stuff like that, if that makes sense. So he was probably actually closer to average height. A lot of primary sources kind of have him listed even as low as 5'2". But you also have to understand they're using French inches, which is not the same as our modern inches, okay? So it's probably, not calculated exactly correctly. But if you look at political cartoons, the British are drawing of Napoleon. They are, when they're engaged in wars against him, British cartoonists have a tendency to draw Napoleon very short in comparison with the British politicians. And this is kind of just to put him down. So those images have become very popular, and I think create this kind of cultural idea that Napoleon was very short, but in reality he was probably maybe on the shorter side of average. And so it's very interesting. And we say that this idea of the little corporal is not reference to his height as much as it is kind of a term of endearment. The fact that, people really love him, and he's really their little corporal, And Napoleon goes on to really distinguish himself, as we said, in battle. In the campaign in Egypt that France is fighting to try and control parts of Egyptian territory, the French, during this time frame, this is when they discovered the Rosetta Stone, and that later allows linguists and historians to unlock Mesopotamian language and hieroglyphics, and so that kind of connects back. But this is the time frame when Napoleon is kind of rising to power through his military service. When Napoleon returns to France after his military victories, he finds that the politics in France are a bit in chaos. Remember, we set the Directory in place, and they're facing all these problems and threats from the Jacobins who want to push things in a more radical direction. And there's people who want to go back to the time of the constitutional monarch, and there's problems with food shortages and economic problems, and all of this stuff is coming to a head. And Napoleon begins to conspire with some politicians that are really unhappy about the direction that France is headed. In particular, he conspires with a man named Roger Ducos, who is one of the 5 directors in France. He also conspires with another man named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. He's a major hero of the French Revolution and was a member of the Third Estate, on board with some very influential, ideas and put out some pamphlets encouraging the Third Estate to take power for itself, and really kind of prompted the French Revolution in the first place. So together, these men conspire with Napoleon to overthrow the Directory. Now, this is a military coup, and Napoleon and these others are leading it. So they're going to kick the directors out of power on November 9th of 1799. Now, remember, the French are using this crazy secular calendar. So under the French calendar, it actually takes place on the 18th of Brumaire, which means windy. And November is kind of a windy month, so the wind blows out, the wind is going to blow out the Directory. And they blow in Napoleon, and he just lands in the Directory. He takes the title of consul. And what was the last time we saw the term consul used? Rome. So he is the consul of France. And he takes the title of first consul and rules with his second and third consuls, which are, of course, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and Roger Ducos. So now hopefully the word consul, as we said, brings to mind the Roman Republic, and we're correct in saying that. And the term specifically makes a connection with ancient Rome. And they're bringing the principles of the ancient Roman Republic to France. But keep in mind that this government, the consulate government, has been brought about through a military coup. And they basically did not legally get elected into power. So technically, they are kind of illegitimately in control. Now, in order to solve that, those consuls that Napoleon, he does try to solve some of the problems that the Directorate had been incapable of solving. One of his successes is reaching out to the Catholic Church and finding a way to kind of cover over that divide that had taken place between the French government and the Catholic Church during the Reign of Terror. He signed the Concordat with the Pope, and what this does is that Napoleon agrees to end the secular calendar. So France returns to the traditional calendar that everybody else uses, and because it's much easier to keep track of what the actual dates of some of these things are happening once you kind of get back on the regular calendar. The Pope agrees that Napoleon and the French government can keep the church under governmental control. So the civil constitution of the clergy remains in force, with the clergy and the priests being paid by the French government and not by the Catholic Church. But in doing so, this does win the goodwill of the French Catholics, because he's now created an agreement with the papacy, and Napoleon will go on the following year to name himself consul for life. Again, who's the guy that did this in Rome? Consul for life? Caesar. How'd that end up for Caesar? Yeah, that dude got stabbed a lot. Well, this story, believe it or not, you would almost think that the stories are the same. And it's an interesting thing that I don't want to get into a conspiracy theory here, but it's very interesting that these stories are incredibly similar.
Does he get stabbed to death?
No, but you'll see. Just the rise and fall. Julius Caesar comes to power because he's a great military leader and all the people love him, and he comes in with two other people and creates the triumvirate, and then he takes over the triumvirate by himself and becomes consul for life. Napoleon is a great military leader. Where was Julius Caesar a great military leader at? Do y'all remember? Gaul. Where's Gaul? France. And then he goes to Egypt. Where does Napoleon get his military victories? In Egypt. Then he comes back and creates a rule of three and then takes over for himself. It is scarily similar, these two stories. It is kind of weird how similar these stories are. And so now Napoleon is consul for life, and he's saying, you can't get rid of me. And 2 years later, he kind of makes his turn towards absolutism, and it becomes more apparent that he's going to become emperor, and it gets rid of the consulate entirely and starts rolling as emperor in 1804. The exact same thing, okay? Now, with each of these changes, Napoleon is going to hold elections. Elections. So he's going to get the will of the people to basically confirm that what he's doing is okay, even though he's becoming an absolutist. Who else did that? Oh, Julius Caesar did that. And they're going to call them the same things now that they did then. He holds plebiscites. That's what they're called, plebiscites. Oh, wait a minute, plebes. That's what the common people in Rome were called. Interesting. And so basically it seems like this is being done by the will of the people, but we know that Napoleon was manipulating a lot of these elections to ensure that he got the outcomes that he desired. Now we can see a shift in the grandeur that Napoleon uses it as a way of maintaining his political power. If you go back a couple of slides, you look at the way he's dressed when he's first consul, you'll see it's pretty simplistic kind of dress. But now in this image, you can see very grand, and he's really presenting himself like an ancient Roman monarch. Like even here, he's wearing the laurel leaves. If you could kind of see this on his head, and that's basically the symbol of Rome. And so he's crowning his wife Josephine, the empress. And so they're wearing these beautiful royal robes. They're bringing about a sense of grandeur back to France. And this actually was something that made a lot of people appreciate Napoleon. They kind of felt like during the time period of the French Revolution that things had kind of gotten bland and stark. And now there's this sense of grandeur back to the people of France. And of course, this comes at a great cost. Financially, it's very expensive, but also at a political cost because the people are giving up their rights in exchange for this kind of pageantry. This leads us to a question that has been hotly debated by historians. Can Napoleon be considered an heir of the revolution or not? And it's a very difficult question to answer because I think for one reason is Napoleon always tries to give off the appearance of being an heir to the revolution. But sometimes his actions, he seems to come a bit short. So Napoleon is he's consistently using the language of liberty in most of his speeches. Napoleon talks about, he's here to save the French Revolution. He's here to ensure the liberties of the people. But then when we look at some of the legislation that he pushes, he's enacting censorship laws. So he's not letting people have the freedom of speech. He's suppressing newspapers and not allowing them to print the news freely. He also wants to get them to, print what he wants them to say. So he's talking about liberties and rights for the people, but then he's not giving them the right to free speech. Another thing that we see is that he does always have the appearance of ruling by popular will. Napoleon likes to have the people issue, plebiscites, and like I said, that's where they go in and vote and be like, no, we're good with this. This is great. But again, Napoleon manipulates these elections to make sure that people vote the way he wants. And so it's a really popular idea that Napoleon is controlling things kind of absolutely, but with the will of the people. Another example is the Civil Code of 1804. So remember, one of the major themes of the French Revolution is equality. And the Civil Code of 1804 is meant to create legal equality amongst French citizens, which is very much something that the French Revolution was trying to do. So under the Civil Code, or as it's known as the Napoleonic Code, we can see that Napoleon is instilling in law freedom of religion, equality under the law. And so he is, in a sense, supporting some aspects of the French Revolution. But on the other hand, we can see that Napoleon is ordering political arrests. So sometimes he'll order the arrest of a political opponent as a mean of suppressing their voice and keeping them from criticizing him. Is that true freedom? Well, probably not. As you can see, he kind of goes back and forth. The other thing we can say about the Napoleonic Code is it does provide the basic equality under the law. It gives many rights to the French male citizens. It does reduce rights for women. For instance, women don't have the rights to divorce from their husbands. They're kind of a second-class citizens under this law. They can't own property. All of their property is owned by their husbands. And this is, we do see that women are not given equal rights under Napoleonic law. When we look at Napoleon's civil administration and how he runs the government, we can see that he also expands education and that he based these things on people's careers on their talents, not their social status, which is good. Part of the leaders of the French Revolution really wanted to see this. However, at the same point in time, he's saying, look, you can have this high position in government even if you don't have elite social status. If you have the ability to do it, you can have this position. But he also brings back the titles of nobility. See, he's kind of just wishy-washy. It's like he doesn't really know. He wants to make everybody happy, right? And which is not, bringing back nobility titles is not something that, the revolutionaries would approve of at all. And we have an image here of him, of one of these ceremonies. He's awarding the Legion of Honor medal to someone that he's going to grant a noble title to. Those nobles that Napoleon creates do have political power, or do not have the same political power that the nobles had prior to the French Revolution. Because remember, Napoleon's not going to share political power with anyone, but it does give them more respect in society, which is another aspect of Napoleon's administration, that he creates a system of prefects or government officials that basically do the jobs very similar to the intendants that we talked about with Louis XIV. And remember, we said the attendants would go out into the countryside and make sure that the king's orders are being carried out and that taxes are being collected and that men are being, being sent to military service. The prefects are going to do very similar jobs in the countryside, except instead of making sure the king's orders are being carried out, they're making sure that Napoleon's orders are carried out. And so in many instances, we can see that in this practice during the time of the absolute monarchy, people didn't like that. Now he's doing it. The last aspect we're going to look at when talking about does he really support the French Revolution and its ideals is looking at his military campaigns. So Napoleon certainly continues the military mission to export the revolution. He's going to lead military campaigns against those absolute monarchs who were trying to invade France and really have retribution against them for trying to stop the French Revolution. And he is very successful at toppling many of these absolute monarchs. And we find him allowing those countries to kind of develop independent liberal governments on their own. But he's also going to exploit his empire for political purposes and gain. So I think that in some ways we can sum up the question if we look at Napoleon's governmental career and sort of see he's good at talking the talk, but he doesn't really walk the walk. And certainly there's an heir, he is an heir of the French Revolution to some points, and it's going to continue to be debated, really. You can see the success that Napoleon has in growing his empire. All the territory in pink and green is parts of Europe that Napoleon is able to conquer. And the parts that are in blue are territories that he's able to maybe not completely control, but is certainly going to use as French territory. So he ends up creating a very massive French empire, basically the entirety of Europe. Look at that. I mean, that's insane. Not since the Roman Empire had this much territory been under one control. And that's going to make some people really angry with him, right? And so Napoleon's very successful in battle for really two main reasons. First, Napoleon wages campaigns of misinformation. He has a tendency to send out spies and plant false stories so that people that he's battling against think that his numbers are smaller than they are, or that his troops are stationed in one spot when they're not really there, or that he's going to attack a particular area so they'll concentrate their defense there, when in reality he has plans to attack somewhere else. And he's very good at this misinformation and catching his enemies off guard. Secondly, Napoleon is also very good at moving fast. So Napoleonic armies move very quickly into the field and allows them to make very fast strikes against their enemy. When you combine these two tactics, Napoleon is incredibly successful in battle. One of the first countries that he fights against is Austria. Remember, Austria has an absolute monarchy. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, was from Austria, and so during the French Revolution, they were one of the monarchies that were trying to reconquer France and reinstall the monarchy, right? And he says, hey, you are enemies of the French Revolution, and we're going to defeat you. And after defeating them in a couple of major battles, he forces Austria to basically become an ally of France. He doesn't make them give up their own government, but they have to become allies of France. He then goes on to conquer other parts of Europe, Holland, Naples, part of Germany, an area known as Westphalia, Spain. But in each case, as we said, he's toppling their absolute monarchs. And he's not getting power into the hands of the people who live in those areas. Instead, he has a tendency to give his family members control of those places he conquers. For instance, you don't need to know these names necessarily, but he has a brother, Louis. He gives Holland to him. And then he gets really upset that Louis is actually trying to learn Dutch and become a good Dutch monarch. And he gets upset with Louis for not exploiting the people. And people are calling, giving him respect as much as Napoleon. And then his brother Joseph gets the area of Naples, and he's going to transfer Joseph to Spain eventually and give him control of Spain. He's also going to bring his sister Caroline in to help rule Naples. The areas that he takes in Germany, parts of Westphalia, he gives to his brother Jerome. So basically, all the territory is being brought back under control of their family. And this is where some of the exploitation comes in, because they're going to overthrow the authoritarian regimes and not give the power to the people. So he's not really exporting the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. He's taking it. And this is going to create a lot of resentment against French rule. To give you a visual imagery of this resentment, we have a very famous painting by the Spanish painter Goya. It's called 3rd of May, and what it is, it commemorates the execution of some Spanish freedom fighters. And these are Spaniards who are about to be executed by the French military because they had the audacity to proclaim that Spain should be ruled by Spaniards and not by French. So you get a sense that the people, some of the people are saying, hey, we're not happy with this guy Joseph and his leadership, and there's going to be uprisings that are going to lead to arrests and executions. Napoleon is also taking control of the rest of Europe, and you can see that, again, in this British political cartoon, they kind of make fun of Napoleon. He's short, and you can see that Napoleon has control of Europe, but he's coming up against the power of Great Britain. And notice that Great Britain has power of the sea, and Napoleon, it's going to be written that he has the biggest military threat. So they're trying to kind of carve up the world is kind of the idea of what this picture is. So they're going to go to war with Britain, and one of the first major battles between France and Britain under the time of Napoleon is the naval battle of Trafalgar. And the British are able to defeat the French Navy in this battle. And what this battle does is it really points out that Britain is going to be dominant over the seas. While France may have an excellent military on land, their Navy just can't match up with the British Navy. And France is basically going to stay trapped on the continent. They're not going to be able to expand beyond the continent of Europe to challenge Britain. And Britain's overseas empires are going to remain strong. But it also, at the Battle of Trafalgar, forces Napoleon to take a different tactic when dealing with Great Britain. Instead of trying to challenge them militarily, he turns to economic warfare. And it's really important thing about this battle between France and Britain is that Napoleon's major plans would be Great Britain is to do, against Great Britain is to do this continental system, which is basically blockade British goods from being imported into the mainland of Europe. And so since he controls a vast majority of the European territory, he says we're not going to let the British import their goods onto this continent, and it's going to cripple them economically and make them very weak. Now, one big flaw of this system is, of course, that Britain has an overseas empire. So Britain just turns around and starts trading with its empire in India, in the Middle East, and in the Americas. And the continental system doesn't significantly hurt Britain all that much. But we do find them turning to smuggling, and they don't have access to French goods anymore, so like French wine, and they're going to try and start smuggling that. And so really, it's not going to hurt the British all that much, and this is going to frustrate Napoleon quite a bit. Things start going pretty badly for Napoleon. It's really going to start going bad for Napoleon around the year 1810 and onward. Napoleon ends up marrying a widow by the name of Josephine a couple slides back, and we saw her coronation. But this marriage does not result in any children, and that he felt like he needed to divorce Josephine and remarry another woman in order to gain an heir. So he marries an Austrian noblewoman by the name of Marie Louise, and that marriage did result in the birth of a son who would be named Napoleon after his father. But this does not provide Napoleon with political stability that he desired. Instead, it becomes even more tension-filled within France itself. It was into this context that Napoleon decides that he needs to launch a new military campaign because the French love Napoleon's victories. And this is one of the ways that Napoleon kind of keeps people happy, is saying, look, France is better than everybody. And the French people are like, yeah, we're the best. We are the best. We are the best in the whole world. We have taken over all of Europe. We make them eat baguettes and crepes. Sorry if that's offensive to French people, but you're French, so go smoke your cigarettes and be fine. And so he decides, what would be a really good military victory for me? If I could defeat Russia. Russia. That's a bad idea, everybody. Nobody defeats Russia. So in 1812, things go devastatingly wrong for Napoleon. He invades Russia, but he doesn't time it well. He leaves France with somewhere around like 5 million troops from his entire empire. And he gets to Russia, and he's winning and winning and winning, and then the Russians are like, oh, we're just going to keep drawing him further and further in. So they would fight him just enough that he would keep chasing after them. And then after he would go through, they would burn all the crops and tear down everything so that there was nothing for the French army to use as far as supplies. And so they draw him further and further and further into Russia. And by the time they almost get to St. Petersburg, winter sets in. And Napoleon's army they thought, oh, we're going to get to St. Petersburg and we're going to have all these supplies from gathering them along the way. And then all the way, they lose all their supplies and all their food. And now they're in the middle of a Russian winter in spring gear with no winter gear and nowhere to stay. And they realize we are now in trouble. And then the Russians start to attack. And Napoleon realizes that he has to retreat. And he's got to get his army out of Russia. The problem is he's about 1,000 miles into Russian territory. And he's like, no problem, we'll just go back and we'll eat all the way, we'll eat all the food and stuff on the way back. And then he realizes they've destroyed all the food and the Russians are just peppering him all the way back. And they say that, somewhere around, he only gets back to France with like 500,000 troops. Devastating. It's embarrassing. They crush him. It's humiliating. And he loses a ton of political support because he basically deserts his own troops and makes them find their own way back to France as best he can. And Russia kind of shows his vulnerability and allows his political enemies to start coming out of the woodwork and eventually leads to him being removed from power. That started his downward spiral and it invigorates his enemies. And while we said that he had conquered vast portions of Europe, he had a tendency to, exploit them. And Britain is going to organize a coalition against Napoleon in Prussia and Austria and Spain and Belgium and Holland. And they're all going to join and wage war against Napoleon, sensing his weakness after his losses in Russia. Napoleon loses a major battle at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. His allies are trying to remove him from power. He manages to persist until 1814 when the allies start talking to some of Napoleon's enemies within France, and they convince those enemies that their war is not against the people of France, but against Napoleon himself. And so by bringing some of Napoleon's French enemies on board, they put pressure on Napoleon to step down. He gets removed from power and exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. However, Napoleon's not done. He deeply resents that he's been removed from power. And so at the first opportunity, he actually escapes from this exile, goes back to France, and after Napoleon had been removed, the French monarchy, the British in them had put a French monarchy back in charge, but the French people didn't like it all. Louis XVI's brother, I think, is put his son is alive, and so he comes to power, but people in France are not enthusiastic about the restoration of the monarchy. And so when Napoleon escapes from Elba, he shows back up and he says, hey, I'm back. I'm going to protect you from this monarchy. And people are like, all right. And King Louis's brother, was a bad monarch anyway. So they look to Napoleon for their salvation. He implements rights and liberties that the Bourbon monarchy is not willing to give the people. And, Napoleon is only in power for about another 100 days, but and so his dramatic return is very short-lived. He ends up fighting a battle at Waterloo against Britain. They're able to crush him. And after the Battle of Waterloo, they were like, well, if you escape from Elba, we'll even put you even further out there. And they put him on the Isle of St. Helena's in the Atlantic Ocean. And they're like, escape from that, son. He lives out the remainder of his days in the South Atlantic on the Isle of St. Helena's under British military guard. He has poor health. The climate does not agree with him. He ends up dying in 1821. But he does leave behind a major legacy, and we see the aftermath of Napoleon's rule that France is going to have another time period of political confusion. They look at, French experience politics in a very extreme way. And they go through a cycle where they have an absolute monarch, then a constitutional monarch, then a republic, then the absolute monarchy again, and then a republic. And they go over these cycles and cycles and cycles. And they do eventually settle on one. But, Napoleon sees the beginnings of this nationalism idea and this band of allies that are eventually going to come to a head when we get to World War I. particularly in Spain and some of these other countries that are going to look at liberalism and apply that to their new way of doing government and pushing back against the absolute monarchs that are trying to control them. And so, ultimately, all of this is going to fill his legacy, even though there were definitely some problems with the way he went about it, and that compromises his legacy some. But the French Revolution and Napoleon have enormous impacts on all of Western civilization, and that's going to bring us to an end of this module.